This is episode 10 of the FAB Podcast on Wisp Sports Radio.
Excuse me.
The FAB Podcast is a weekly show for women in sports business, co-produced by Females in Athletic Business, Inc., a nonprofit corporation that provides education, networking, and mentorship to women working in sports, and Wisp Sports Radio. Welcome to this week's episode. My name is Kristin Ray, and I'm the founder of Females in Athletic Business and one of your hosts of the FAB Podcast. Before we get to our main guest this week, we're going to chat with Carrie Lewis, creator of the Girls Beer Sports Podcast. She's here to tell us about her very unique podcast for women sports lovers. So welcome, Carrie, to the FAB Podcast.
Great. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. I'm so excited to have another female who's running her podcast. So let's start by hearing about what prompted you to create the Girls Beer Sports Podcast and what exactly are the goals for your podcast?
Sure. Well, okay. I've kind of had been wanting to get into podcasting for a while and was like, okay, what do I like? What are things that I like that I would like to talk about, on a daily basis or regular basis? And what is something that is kind of there's not a market out there for it, right? There's an audience, but there's not a whole lot going on in that world. Well, I like sports a lot. My life revolves around sports, watching sports, whatever. And I like beer. So I thought, I'm going to start a podcast where me and three other girls, and the dynamic that I wanted it to be accessible to people who like sports and who also don't know anything about sports. So it's me who knows a lot about sports, my friend Lee who knows a lot about sports, our friend Stacy, she kind of comes in and out every once in a while. She knows some about sports, and then my friend Lauren who knows literally nothing about sports. She's one of these yay sports ball people, right?
Carrie, I love that idea. So I just think that is something that's so unique because I feel like it's either women talking about anything but sports because they hate it, or women talking sports with other women who are talking sports. And that's what I love about your crew is that there's something for everyone. And I think as a sports lover, I think there's a uniqueness to having someone who doesn't know and love about sports in a sports conversation, and also vice versa. I think women who aren't really into sports would get a kick out of hearing take on women who are into sports, maybe about things that aren't necessarily about sports. So I think I love that about
absolutely.
your show.
Yeah. Thank you. And Lauren, she asks good questions because she's looking at it from an outside perspective. And it's she asks a question like, oh my God, we never even thought of that. Well, yeah. And, we don't get super in depth into statistics and, all of that kind of thing. I call us sports attainment. So yeah, we talk about sports, but it's on kind of an entertainment level. We also talk about all kinds of other different stuff too.
So give us some examples of what else you're talking about.
Okay. So we have a segment, that we've started doing called Take It or Leave It. And it can be any kind of topic. Like yesterday, when we recorded our show yesterday, let's see, we had Indianapolis 500. So we had a sports topic. We had, in New York City, they're selling gold covered chicken wings, edible, right? So that's a topic. Okay. This new crazy rated R puppet movie that's coming out. That was a take it or leave it. And then Vegas going to the NHL finals. That was a take it or leave it topic. So we kind of intermix pop culture, current events, that kind of thing. I will say the one thing we do not do is politics. We absolutely do not do politics.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's probably smart that you don't go into politics or religion because, everyone always says those are the two off-topic or, off-limits topics. And there's just so much going on that intertwines with sports and pop culture and politics that I can see that it might be honestly hard when you're kind of going into letting yourself go into pop culture and letting yourself go into what might be pop culture sports. How is it hard to not get too into politics with that?
It's not, because we've created a fake show for ourselves. So when things start kind of going down that road, we look at each other and say, oh, that's for boots in politics. And we just leave it on the table.
I love that. Okay. So you're able to stop each other, call each other out, be like, yep, this is the moment where the other show takes over. I really like that. I love your sense of humor.
And that's a fake show. It doesn't exist.
Right. As probably most of you are okay with.
Yes. Yeah.
So tell me why you think that this type of show is important to have out in the podcast world, especially in this time in our culture as it relates to women.
Well, like I said, there's just not a lot of shows, in my opinion, out there like this. And, we're an intelligent show. And I think that that's important to realize that, women can speak intelligently about things like sports and beer. We actually know what we're talking about. And I think that that's made us relatable to people. We've actually had brewers in the community on, and to talk about beer, and have actually kind of become, these guys are like, oh, wow, man, you really know what you're talking about. I've had people on Twitter, say, you all really know what you're talking about, and I know there's other women out there like that, like us, that like the same things and know what they're talking about. And I just feel like our podcast kind of fills that, I want to say void, but I really feel like there's not a lot out there like we are.
Well, that is an interesting segue to something I wanted to run by you. Before I started Females in Athletic Business, which is a trade organization for women working in the sports industry, I was filtering my passion for sports and talking sports through, I think, what might have been a similar podcast to what you all are doing, except for it was almost exclusively listened to by my friends. And I was okay with that. But I did it with another young lady at the time who I was really close friends with. And we always got that same novel reaction when we were out, whether we were out at a bar watching the game or out with our friends watching the game. There was always this reaction to, oh, you really know what you're talking about. Or, oh, like, you guys are girls and you're at B-dubs watching the game. That's new and different. And while there was cuteness to that, or it was fun sometimes, it got to be, I don't know, a little annoying sometimes. And so we challenged ourselves to do this survey. And granted, it was not scientific at all. But the short version is we sent out this survey to a lot of women and a lot of men who were on different spectrums, ends of the spectrum in terms of sports fandom. And our goal was to figure out what was the social line of social acceptability for women's knowledge of sport. Because we experienced that there was a line that we often crossed in terms of when did it stop being cute to other women that we knew about sports and maybe become threatening? Or to men, when did it seem like a novel thing, and when did it become we're trying too hard in their eyes? And I wonder, have you experienced these things with other women or other men, whether you're in a social situation or maybe even a dating situation, where it's become, your knowledge of sports has become less of a positive thing and more of a liability?
I personally haven't. I've kind of, I guess, been really lucky in that respect, in that my husband loves the fact that that's something we do together, right? Is sports. That's like our thing. And a lot of my guy friends and stuff, they're like, it's just, I know what I'm talking about, and they're fine with it. Now, I will say that I want to say that Lee, because we've talked about this, we talked about this in early on when we first started the show. And, she's gotten some of that. And she especially has kind of a problem because she's big into softball. She's coached softball and plays softball. And, she gets pigeonholed, you know what I'm saying? In terms of her playing softball. And, which it really kind of sucks for her in that respect because, and it's ridiculous. But, she has had, in the past, I think because she is single, guys that are a little bit intimidated by the fact that, she can sit there and watch a football game and scream at the TV, just like anybody else.
Right. And use the same words and know the same things that these guys are knowing. And through our survey, we figured out that with guys, it's cute to a point for us to know as much about them. And then it becomes, I just want to be your bro. Now you're not in my dating pool anymore. And with women, most of the time, they really respect your knowledge for sports until it becomes something that guys like. And then it's now threatening and maybe you're faking a little bit or you're trying too hard or you're doing it on purpose. And so I think it's interesting. The more women I hear having podcasts about sports, the more I hope and pray that those factors are, subsiding a little bit in our social culture. And that's why I think it is so important for you all to have podcasts like you do and to keep it up and to keep talking about things that, hopefully people are getting more and more comfortable hearing women talk about. So,
well, and I think that they are, because I found in Twitter, on the Twitter world that, that I inhabit, for Girls Beer Sports, that all the podcast guys that I've encountered have been nothing but super supportive of us.
Yeah, I found that too once I started this organization and once I started really talking about this topic specifically, the people who are choosing to be out there talking about sports are comfortable with women talking sports in general. It's the people who, make sports more of a hobby, I guess, or, just the average fan that seems to still be maybe a touch uncomfortable with it. But like I said, I think we're getting more and more accepted every day in this world. And that's what you and I and most of the women that are putting themselves in these positions are looking to do. So before we wrap up, please tell our listeners more about where and when they can listen to the Girls Beer Sports podcast.
So we're all over the place. We're on iTunes. So, you can get us on iTunes. You can get us on iHeartRadio. You can get us on the Spreaker app, that Spreaker platform. We're on SoundCloud too. At least our latest 2 episodes, I always put those on SoundCloud. But, iTunes, if you want that just immediately get pushed into your podcast queue. You can find us on Twitter. I'm very active on the social media at GRLS Beer Sports. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. You can email us at girlsbeersports@gmail.com. I'm trying to think. I always end up forgetting the platforms that we're on because we're on so many.
But pretty much everyone that most people are listening to podcasts on, you'll be there. And when do your shows come out?
Every Monday, usually 9:30 Eastern Standard Time.
All right. So you guys are doing this kind of late in the day and probably drinking beer while you're doing it, I imagine.
Absolutely. We drink a different beer. Each one of us does every week and review it at the end of the show. And then we'll post.
I love it.
We'll post pictures and that kind of thing. Now, I will say the other interesting thing about our show is Lee is gluten-free. She's celiac. She'll freely tell you that she is. But she drinks, she'll drink cider or some kind of gluten-free alcoholic beverage on the show.
Well, I need to make sure to tune in more often. I've listened to several episodes because this girl is a cider drinker. Well, she will be in a few months because I'm not drinking alcohol right now, but I should make a list for when I get to do that again.
Okay.
Well, Carrie, I just want to say thank you again for being with us today. I hope that our sports loving listeners of the FAB podcast find their way over to you guys because it is funny, it is lighthearted, and it is something, if you've had a bad day, just to feel like you can chat with some other girls who are like-minded always feels refreshing. So thank you so much for being with us today, and good luck moving forward.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
It was so fun to hear from another empowered woman making her mark in the podcast world. We hope all of our listeners will take a moment to check out the Girls Beer Sports podcast. Now onto our feature interview. Today we are continuing a series on mental health for women working in sports business. I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Kimberly Elsbach of UC Davis Graduate School of Management. Welcome, Dr. Elsbach.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. First, will you start out by telling us a little bit about the type of research that you do, on a daily basis at UC Davis?
Sure. I study perception and particularly how people perceive each other, also how people perceive leaders, and especially in organizational contexts, how people perceive their organizations as a whole.
That is really interesting. And the more I read about your work, the more I was so interested in the fact that there's a whole part of your industry that really thinks and talks about how we perceive each other at work and how we perceive our employers and our leaders. And I think that's so relevant for what we want to talk about today. This is the second installment, if you will, in our mental health series, Dr. Elsbach. And we spoke the first time about exhaustion at work and how that can possibly lead to burnout. And I want to talk today more about the struggle that some women in our industry feel in terms of handling their emotions at work. And just for some background, a few months back, the organization that I work with, Females in Athletic Business, did a very unscientific survey, so not nearly on your level. But we did discuss the emotional stressors that women are feeling at work in the sports industry. And some of the factors that our members said made them the most emotional at work was the fear that they're not fitting in these male-dominated environments, the fear that they're not being included equally, whether that's opportunities or just being included in the everyday stuff, the fear of failure, and finally the exhaustion that can come from carrying more than their share of the workload, which women often feel like they have to do to get ahead or even stay on pace with the men around them. And so we didn't turn our survey into specifically crying or tears at work, and that's hopefully where you come in. And you did a wonderful study on the effects of crying and showing emotion at work. So can you give a summary of what that specific study found in regards to women crying at work and how that would affect their standing at work or how they're perceived?
Sure. One of the things to know about crying is crying itself is not an emotion. It's the expression of an emotion. And It can be associated with many different emotions, from joy and happiness to frustration, anger, sadness. The other thing to be mindful of is that the emotions that women and men experience at work are the same. They both experience frustration. They both experience stress. They both experience anger at times and sadness. Unfortunately, women often, not unfortunately, but sometimes for them, they express those emotions through crying. And part of this has to do with how they're socialized as children. Boys, when they're growing up, learn how not to cry. They learn this on the playground and in grade school. And so by the time they're adults, when they feel the emotion of anger or frustration, they express it in different ways: shouting, pounding on a table. But women, when they're growing up as girls, don't learn, for the most part, this skill of how not to cry. And so when they experience emotions such as anger or frustration, they often do cry as a way to express that emotion. So men and women don't feel anything different. They just express it differently. Unfortunately for women, the perception of crying is very different than the perception of other expressions of emotion, like shouting or raising one's voice or pounding on a table. And what we found is there are very specific expectations for how you should react to emotions at work. And we identified what we called scripts for 4 common situations in which women feel strong emotions at work. And part of these scripts is whether or not to cry, and if you do start tearing up, how to deal with that. And women who violated those scripts were often perceived very negatively. They were perceived as weak, unprofessional, and in some cases manipulative.
Wow. So tears have even been seen by people at work as something that women might be doing on purpose to achieve some sort of end to this wow. Okay.
The common situation in which that happens that we found was during negative performance evaluation or performance feedback that's critical. In those cases, women who cry excessively are often seen as using the crying manipulatively to prevent the feedback from getting through, or to avoid having to deal with and respond to the critical feedback. And in those cases, the effect of the crying can be very negative on a woman's on perceptions of the crier.
Ooh, that's a lot to take in, and it's honestly, as somebody who I consider myself very quick to cry, and do you have any specific like statistics on how many women have, what percentage of women find themselves crying at work in high pressure situations? Or did you not, did the study not touch on that? That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, we didn't touch on that, but there is a whole set of researchers in Holland, as it turns out, who study adult crying, and they have developed what they call a crying proneness scale that measures individual differences on how likely you are to cry in any situation. And with that scale, they can measure individual differences in terms of your just average proneness to crying. So there is great variance across individuals in terms of crying proneness, and that's for men and for women. But as a whole, women are much more prone to crying. And I think this, again, has to do with the socialization that they learn as girls, and the fact that they don't learn how not to cry.
Well, it explains a lot. And the nature versus nurture thing, kind of, it seems obvious that, we raise our girls different than boys, but I think it's something that needs to be said and needs to be thought and talked about more, so that we can be more tolerant of each other at work. And I think that would be the first step, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, there are two really big takeaways. One is that because crying is an expression of emotion, and it's an expression of the same emotions that everyone feels, that it shouldn't be stigmatized, that it's just a different way of expressing emotion. On the other hand, until we can come to a greater acceptance of it, there's things that organizations and individuals can do to minimize the negative perceptions that they may garner if they cry. So organizations can do things like make sure that they have private spaces for performance evaluations, that these things are done in private, so that the crying doesn't spill over out into public. One of the things that we found was most damaging to female criers at work was if the crying was perceived as disrupting the work of others, then the women who were crying were perceived as most unprofessional. And so having a private space for stressful events, having private spaces that women can go to, if women and men can go to if they need to get their emotions under control. And those are some things organizations can do. Managers can make sure that they understand that crying is just an expression of emotion, and so that they shouldn't unduly penalize people who cry. And then criers themselves can do things. If you feel yourself starting to cry or tear up, to make sure that you remove yourself from a situation in which that crying might disrupt the work of others. That kind of crying is really detrimental to your perception. And then if you cry in a performance evaluation, make sure that the person giving the evaluation, make sure that you let them know that you do want to hear the feedback, that you do want to take it on, and that maybe what you need to do is take a break and revisit or restart the performance evaluation later, or come back to it, just to make clear that you're not trying to avoid taking on this feedback, but that you just get yourself under control before you can go further.
So one thing that I've done, and maybe you can tell me if this was a good idea, bad idea, so that people can maybe see if it would work for them, is especially in performance evaluations, whether they're formal or just, the everyday feedback that, hopefully your boss is giving you, good or bad, is very early on, I let my boss know that I am an emotional crier. When I am emotional, I often cry. And that most often it really expresses the fact that I really care about what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great strategy.
Like you said, I do want to know exactly what you're saying, and I am so passionate about improving myself. But if I tear up, it's because I really care, and I wouldn't be this emotional if what we were talking about didn't matter to me.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific strategy to just prepare the person, because I think the other thing that the research on adult crying has found is that people react to crying as they would with a child, and that is their initial instinct is to help, but they often don't know what to do. And so if you can, sort of preface the performance evaluation with this explanation for why you might cry, then it helps the evaluator to know what to do. And that it doesn't mean,
and not to panic when they don't know what to do, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's great advice. So, and it's encouraging to know that even though I'm a crier, I might be doing it at least in the most productive way. So there are a couple books I've read that have touched on this topic, and one of them was called The Feminist Fight Club. It was by Jessica Bennett, and it really touches on specifically the everyday trials of working in a male-dominated office. And Lean In, obviously, by Sheryl Sandberg, who, this book, most women who are in any sort of empowerment situation, they read, or most women have read that book. And that those two books touch on that we should maybe talk about being our authentic selves. And if that means crying at work, that's okay. But knowing how competitive and often male-dominated the sports industry is, would you think, and I don't know if your study touched on this, would you guess that crying or showing emotional vulnerability at work in a male-dominated environment would be more or less, I guess, troubling or have a bigger negative effect than in a more traditional, more even workplace?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of the interesting things that we found is that in our study, we had we focused on talking to people who had observed crying at work, and half our sample were men and the other half were women. So we talked to men and women who had observed women crying. And we found no difference across the men and the women in terms of how critically they perceived criers. So the women were just as tough on female criers as were the men. Now we don't see a big gender difference, but what you're talking about is more of a cultural difference. So the culture of a sports industry, and that we don't have data on. And I think you may be right that in certain industries that have a culture that's more machismo, for lack of a better word, that there may be more harsh evaluations of criers because that is seen as something that doesn't belong in that industry.
Oh yeah, I mean, from what I've experienced, it's not as much that I'm a girl or that the men who may see me cry are men. It's that this type of industry or this atmosphere, they don't have time for this drama, if you will, as they might see it, or and this isn't just me. This is obviously feedback I've heard from other women in preparation for this podcast. But they don't have time for the drama, like you said. They don't want to be distracted by it, and then they also don't want, they don't want to see you as weak. Weakness is not something that's often tolerated or appreciated, and so you're right. I think it's less of a gender thing and more of an attitude, a cultural environment thing in the sports industry that might lend itself to, being more tough on emotional women or women who end up crying at work. Would you say that sounds right?
Yeah. And it's not, and I wouldn't say it's emotional. It's just specific expressions of emotion, because I would guess that men who get emotional but express that by shouting or pounding, they would actually be perceived more positively, perhaps, in that environment. Yeah.
Certainly in my experience, that's correct. Yeah. That it's, in my experience and the experience of others that I've spoken to, it is definitely acceptable to, display emotion and with maybe foul language or, what might be seen as more of a temper situation than it would be to cry, for sure. So, okay, we have dug in a little bit, but we're going to take a break here to introduce a new segment that is particularly relevant to this week's episode. Dr. Peggy Keiper of the University of Alaska Fairbanks will be joining us monthly to discuss an empowering book that she's read. So for her first installment, here's Dr. Keiper.
Okay, well, welcome and thank you for taking the time to listen today. My name is Dr. Peggy Keiper, and I am an assistant professor of business administration at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I teach undergraduate sports business, undergraduate general business courses, as well as MBA courses within the School of Management. I also bring about 8 years of sports industry experience as a college basketball coach, director of business management for an NBA development league team, as well as working in sports tourism as a national sports sales manager and marketing manager for the city of Albuquerque and West Michigan Sports Commission. The book that I chose to review, it was written by Sheryl Sandberg. It's called Lean In, and it was written in 2013. And for those of you who are not familiar, Sandberg is the COO of Facebook. She's also the founder of leanin.org and obviously the author of the book. She spent time working at Google, and in 2012, she was actually identified as one of the most influential people in the world by Time magazine. So obviously, Facebook is not a sports-specific organization, but they do have a sports arm within their organization. We have a little bit of a unique connection to that, sports arm within their organization, in that the director of global sports strategy and partnerships for Facebook is Dan Reed, who is a Michigan guy, and obviously FAB is headquartered in Michigan. Dan Reed was also the president of the D League when I was working in the D League, so kind of just a fun connection there. The main reason, though, that I chose this book, and it has nothing to do with the connection of having a Michigan connection or a Dan Reed connection, but it's because the book is, in my opinion, one of the most prominent and most appropriate books to lead off a book on, or a book review section that deals with strong women in business, and specifically sports business. So it's not a sports specific book, but it is considered, in my opinion, one of the top women leadership books out there. And that's not just my opinion. If you look at nearly any list that in regard to women in business or women in leadership, Lean In is going to consistently be in the top 5 or top 10 on that list. It is a great book. So like any book, I do want to mention that there are pros and cons, and potentially your opinion may vary from mine. So keep in mind that this is solely my opinion, and there is not a ton of time to do a book review, but I am going to hit on a key point within the book that I think hopefully will get you interested in reading the book or interested in the organization, the leanin.org organization. The specific topic that I want to discuss is the mentor-mentee relationship. Sandberg spends a bit of time in her book discussing the importance of mentorship, and specifically she touches on the topic of finding a good mentor, which I find extremely relevant and important for our young women out there, or specifically women that are looking to break into the sports industry, or who are maybe currently navigating their career, like tough decisions about maybe salary negotiations, or maybe dealing with sexual harassment or whatever it might be within the workplace. But her points, I think, are extremely relevant of mentioning, and that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time here discussing. First and foremost, she discusses the importance in her chapter on mentorship of not ever asking someone to be a mentor. And I wholeheartedly agree with this, that I think you need to consider the way that you go about finding a mentor is actually building a genuine relationship with that mentor or with that mentee. And the topic of mentorship is obviously extremely relevant for us within the FAB organization, because it is one of our core values and part of our mission as an organization. Okay. So the second point that she makes is that a mentor's time is extremely valuable. And I think that our listeners can get a lot of relevant information and a lot of relevant advice here, and that don't ever waste a mentor's time. Listen and be prepared. And she gave the example of don't ask vague questions. So if you want to know, and she gave this specific example of, could you, if you go into a mentor-mentee, maybe lunch or coffee, you ask your mentor, what is the culture of your organization? That shows the mentor that you did not prepare for the meeting. So always come prepared and be cognizant of their time. Okay. The third point that she gives is view feedback as a gift. And I, again, fully condone this advice. And on that same note is to be open and willing to hear what their advice is. Okay. And the last point that she made in this section was to build trust with your mentor. And this goes back to the first point, in that building a genuine relationship and being a trustworthy individual is part of an extremely important aspect of being a good mentor and a good mentee. So for the listeners today, this is obviously just one component of the book, but generally speaking, I highly recommend this book. I have read it a number of times, and specifically, I recommend the organization Lean In as well. There's a great resource out there for young women in business. It's obviously not sport specific, but this is just another tool that you can add to your toolbox for a young woman going into business. So I think it just gives you another platform for networking and professional development. Okay. So that's all I have for today. I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to giving you another suggestion on a great book next month. If you as a listener have a suggestion on a book and you'd like to see one reviewed, please feel free to email me, or if you want to discuss the topic, again, feel free to email me. My email is mkeiper, so MKEIPER @alaska.edu. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you so much for that recommendation, Dr. Keiper. So as a review for today's episode, I am Kristin Ray, founder of Females in Athletic Business, and today we're talking with Dr. Kimberly Elsbach of UC Davis, who is an expert on topics like leadership in organizations. So as we were talking earlier about how the difference in crying may be related to how we raise our kids starting very, very early, I wonder if it might be related to, or if you could help us understand why women in the workplace are often expected to do some very traditional things, traditional or even stereotypical female, in quotes, things like not act too aggressively or too assertively, or often, even if they're not a secretary, they're asked to take notes in a meeting, or, plan the Christmas party, even if that's not in their job description. So do these really traditionally stereotypical women things. But when they do other, say, typical things like crying at work, that is not as acceptable as the other kind of traits that are given to women, whether they like it or not. And why there might be such a discrepancy of when we're, say, quote, allowed to be feminine and when we're not.
Yeah. There's a scholar at Princeton University named Deborah Tannen, who's done a lot of research on how men and women speak differently and their differences in how they express themselves at work. And she calls this the double bind, which is that women are expected to be feminine in many ways and express these sort of feminine traits But they're also expected to be business people at work and act professionally, and that they find themselves having to balance these two things. Some if they're too feminine, then they're not professional enough. If they're too professional, they're not feminine enough. And that this is what she calls the double bind. It often gets professional women into difficult situations because of these dual and competing expectations. And there are also a lot of researchers who study this as role conflict, that people see women as having these two roles and they can't seem to separate them at work. That they can't say, okay, you're at work now, you're not mom anymore. you're my boss now. And so I need to treat you differently. And so, there's not one simple answer to this. It's a complex problem. But a lot of it has to do with training, those around us, to, view people in the roles that they're occupying at the moment. And to understand that at work, you're a supervisor, or you're a manager, or you're an analyst, or whatever your job is, and that the expectations should be concomitant with that role, not some other role.
And it's just so interesting, because I think in the sports industry, it might even be taken up a notch to what you've been talking about, because if you're in an office that's predominantly male, you're doing your best to maybe be seen as, quote, one of the guys, or just you're doing your best to make sure that everyone's as comfortable with you being in maybe discussions that aren't traditionally business-like or professional in terms of the language they're using, or how they're talking to each other. And so you're doing your best to put yourself in a situation where you're seen as just another member of the office. And then sometimes, I've heard women say, but then people will look at me and say, oh, sorry for using that language in front of you, or, let me carry that for you. And so there's such a fine line between letting yourself be treated as a woman in the ways that is traditionally men want to treat a woman, whether those are good or bad. And then also being seen as, you want to be equal as well. So it's a very hard thing to do in an office full of guys, because you want to be respected in the way that traditionally men respect women, but you also want to be seen as equal and as a peer. And so I think there is just so much on this topic of communication between genders at work, especially when it comes to when emotion is expressed because of the crying, or because of how, how would you consider the way most men express emotion at work? What's a good word for it? To me, a lot of times I've seen it's short-tempered sometimes, or how are they labeling it in your research when it's not crying?
Yeah, well, so again, in our research, we focused on women who were crying at work. We actually did have a very small subsample of men who cried at work, and we decided not to include them in the final study because we just had so few examples that we didn't think we could say anything definitive about them. But we tried to. So what's interesting is for men who experience emotion at work, they're often, so the word temper comes up, occasionally, the word frustration comes up. So people identify the emotions correctly. But nobody bats an eye, really. I mean, sometimes they'll say, boy, he occasionally you might hear something like, he was a little bit out of control. That's sort of the worst you would hear, in terms of somebody really losing one's temper. It's a euphemism for, sort of being out of control. And that's sort of the worst case scenario for a man, is to lose composure.
Sure. Well, Dr. Elsbach, I really feel like we could go on forever on this topic because I do think it's so important for us to be more ready to handle, different ways that people are expressing their emotion at work, whether we're women or men. But I thank you so much for being with us today. I know you do very important work and you're very busy and in a completely different time zone. So thank you again for being with us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And is there any information you want to give our listeners about where to find your research, or if they had more questions about what you study?
Absolutely. So there's two places you can look. You can look at the Academy of Management, AOM.org. That's a great resource for finding research in all management areas. And then if you go to a Graduate School of Management at UC Davis, so gsm.ucdavis.edu, and you click on my webpage, you'll see links to all my research and other media that I've done that might be relevant to crying at work.
Well, thank you so much again for being with us. And for more conversations from the world of women's sports, visit wispsports.com, where you'll find more than 700 podcast episodes, blogs, videos, and articles. And follow on social media at Wisp Sports. You can also download the podcast from Wisp Sports Radio on the iTunes podcast store. To learn more about our organization, Females in Athletic Business, Inc., a nonprofit organization that provides education, networking, and mentorship to women in sports, join for free at www.fabsportsorg.com. The FAB Podcast is a co-production of Females in Athletic Business and Wisp Sports. Check us out at FabSports.org on social media. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the FAB Podcast.